Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
The Red Apple Media Podcast Network presents This is Protecting America. Now, here's Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby.
And welcome to another edition of Protecting America. I'm Rita Cosby. So how close is Iran to a nuclear device? And what role does China have in facilitating the world's biggest sponsor of terror? And how well equipped is China militarily, especially compared to the United States? Well, joining us now to discuss this and more is the great Asia expert Gordon Chang. His Twitter handle is Gordon G. Chang. And among his books, Plan Red, China's project to destroy America, as well as the coming collapse of China, and China is going to war. Gordon, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Rita.
How big of a role does China play with Iran and with others that are wishing terror amongst many people around the globe?
In general, I think that China has really authorized and supports Iran's attack on Israel. So I think that October 7th is, in a sense, a Chinese project. Iran would never have been able to afford this assault were it not for China's elevated commodity purchases. And to just give you an example, in 2023 and 2024, China took over 90% of Iran's exports of crude oil. But it's more than that. It's diplomatic support, it's propaganda support, it's weapon support. All of Iran's three major proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi militia, have large quantities of Chinese weapons. And Iran would not be able to field weapons of its own were it not for Chinese components, such as computer chips. So really what we see is China's direct involvement in Iran's attack on the Middle East and on Israel.
Do you believe that that support is amping up, that it's getting bigger, or is it the same over the last few years?
I think over the last couple of years, we've seen China's support increase. And just to give you an example, in 2017, we saw, in 2023, China's imports of Iranian crude oil were about 60% above that in 2017. I mentioned 2017 because that was the last year before the Trump administration reimposed sanctions on the purchase of Iranian crude. So you can see that in the last few years, China's purchases have substantially increased over the last 5-year period. And we're seeing, I think, China work much more closely with Tehran. So, for instance, last July 23rd, we saw 14 Palestinian factions come to the Chinese capital, sign the Beijing Declaration, and this was a part of Iran's project to support the Palestinians. So Beijing and Tehran are working hand in glove in supporting terrorists.
You talked about the money train. How much money is China sort of investing in Iran and defying world sanctions?
Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, China and Iran inked up their comprehensive strategic partnership. This was a 25-year deal. China was supposed to invest something like $400 billion over the period of this agreement. I don't know if China is actually going to pony up the entire amount because China often doesn't meet its commitments. But you can see by the size of the arrangement that this is substantial. And of course, this is much greater than it was in previous periods. So China has made the public commitment to support the Iranian regime to the hilt.
What about philosophically, too? Is there a philosophical alignment of sort of this axis of evil kind of coming together there?
Yeah, this is what people call the red-green axis. Red for communism, green for Muslim terrorism. And Tehran, of course, is the green part of that. This has been going on for quite some time, but I think that over the last several years, we have seen China increase its support. And the reason is, if you go back about 7-8 years, China was trying to be friends with everybody in the Middle East, with Israel, with the Palestinians, with Iran, with Jordan, everybody, Saudi Arabia. But in the first Trump administration, China decided it was going to change course and go all in on the Palestinians and turn its back on Israel. So there's been a real change in China's commitment to the Palestinian cause and, of course, to the mullahs in Tehran. Now, this hasn't worked out quite so well for Beijing because the Palestinians are on the losing end of this. We see Israel decimating Hamas, decimating Hezbollah. But that was Beijing's choice. And so it's clear their direction they're going. They are siding with the worst elements in the Middle East.
What made them sort of push towards the Palestinians versus sort of playing with everybody?
I think it was when Beijing saw the success of the first Trump administration with the 4 Abraham Accords. Those were historic. There were 2 in the Persian Gulf, Bahrain and UAE, United Arab Emirates, and then 2 in nearby North Africa, Sudan and Morocco. And I think that Beijing saw that the United States was actually making a lot of headway in the region. And they felt that by being on the sidelines, by trying to be friends with everybody, they weren't getting anywhere. So they took the opposite side. And at first, they seemed to be doing okay because they had that historic agreement between Saudi Arabia and Tehran in 2023. Then they brokered the Beijing Declaration, which I just talked about, the 14 Palestinian fronts going to Beijing. But that all fell apart very quickly for China. And so we're seeing, I think, China having made the wrong strategic choice. Now, it could always pivot, but I think that it is really far too deep into the Palestinian cause right now to back out.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
Here in America, work is in trouble. We've offshored our manufacturing, sent away good jobs, and lost so much ability to make things. American Giant is a company that's pushing back against this tide. They make high-quality clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more right here in the USA. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, promo code STAPLE20.
Wow. So where do you see that relationship headed? And I guess how close is President Xi? Has he had any communication with, the head of Iran, with any of the Ayatollahs even?
I don't think anything that we have seen in public, but I'm sure that it is going on behind the scenes, largely because the relationship in general has been getting closer and closer between the Chinese and the Iranians. So I wouldn't be surprised if Xi Jinping has had direct contact with, for instance, the Supreme Leader. But I don't know that.
What about China and Russia? Because obviously there's a strong alignment there, too.
I think that that relationship is a lot closer than most people think. President Trump is trying what's called the reverse Nixon. In other words, trying to woo Vladimir Putin away from Xi Jinping. I don't think that that's really practical right now. Nixon in the early 70s was able to get Mao Zedong away from Khrushchev, but that was already because Moscow and Beijing had split. And it was easier for Nixon to be able to convince the Chinese that they needed help in their struggle with the Soviets. Right now, we see Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping very close because they identify their interests as the same. They see they both have the same enemy, which is the United States. And in general, I think they view the world in the same terms. And so China's support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been from the very beginning. You know, the Chinese green-lighted that invasion with that joint statement on February 4th, 2022, where they declared their no-limits partnership. And since then, we have seen China's elevated commodity purchases from Russia. There's been the supply of weapons, diplomatic support, propaganda support. The Chinese have opened up their financial and banking system to Russian institutions that have been sanctioned. So they're very close right now. And Vladimir Putin understands that he needs China's support across the board.
Yeah, and that's the big issue, too. There's clearly a reliance by Putin, too. It seems that China's sort of the big player in that, which is interesting, right? Because they're really the ones driving Russia in many ways or controlling Russia.
Yes, because Russia would not be able to maintain this war in Ukraine were it not for continued Chinese support. So, for instance, you have the North Korean troops, North Korean artillery shells, and short-range ballistic missiles. That probably was masterminded, that relationship between Pyongyang and Moscow, I think was masterminded by the Chinese, because the Chinese wanted to make sure the Russians stayed in the war, so they leaned on their good friend Kim Jong-un. You know, a lot of people will say, well, you know, the Chinese and the North Koreans don't get along. And to a certain extent, that's true, because the Chinese and the Koreans have been fighting each other for 600 years. But the point here is that Kim Jong-un knows that he needs China's support to maintain his regime. And so when the Chinese really want something, Kim Jong-un says yes. And the Chinese really wanted to see the North Koreans support the Russian war effort.
You know, explain to our folks why China wants to maintain Russia having this war.
I think that Xi Jinping has two primary overall strategic objectives, and that is he wants to rule the world. He sees Russia as very helpful to that. And there's two reasons why. Because Xi Jinping reveres Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic, and Mao had two very interesting foreign policy approaches, which we see in Xi Jinping's policies of today. First one is Mao in 1949 prevailed over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists because Mao was able to, quote, encircle the cities from the countryside. And I think that Xi Jinping views Ukraine, Israel, North Africa as countryside, and that we are the city. And we also see this in the second thing that Mao did. Mao really believed in disruption of the current system. He believed that to do that, China would advance. And I think that Xi Jinping believes the same thing, that if he can trigger wars or proxy wars, that will divert the United States, that will help China in its goal to completely control humanity. So it's the destruction of societies around the world are, in Xi Jinping's view, merely intermediary steps on his path to complete control of humanity. Now, I know that that sounds ludicrous, but that's the way the Chinese think right now. And we have to look at it from the way Xi Jinping looks at it, not the way that we look at it.
How does Xi Jinping look at Taiwan? How does he look at the Philippines? Because those are obviously two other big hotspots.
He views, I think, Taiwan as too hard a target right now. And so he wants an easy win. And so he is picking on what he thinks to be a weak link, which is the Philippines. But the Filipinos don't take this very well. And they have, through pluck and through really a lot of, I don't know exactly the words I would say, but they're just defiant. And so they're giving the Chinese a very hard time in the South China Sea. Xi Jinping has a problem right now. Xi is being held responsible for China's many, many crises, simultaneous crises. He's also got a military right now which is really unhappy with the Chinese leader. And we're seeing a lot of purges at the top of the Chinese military. And it's not clear that Xi Jinping is doing the purging. the objective evidence suggests that Xi Jinping's enemies are purging Xi's loyalists at the top of the Chinese military. And that makes it very difficult for him to, for instance, launch an invasion of the main island of Taiwan. Because to do that, Xi Jinping needs the complete loyalty of the Chinese military. He needs to give some general or admiral almost complete control over the People's Liberation Army. And Xi Jinping doesn't trust anybody in the military right now to do that. So it's a very precarious situation for China's leader because he's in trouble across the board.
And why is there such dissension even within the ranks of the military against Xi? It's interesting to hear that. That's a good sign, obviously, for the rest of the world. But why is that existing?
Xi Jinping has disrupted the military. He did that because he wanted to reorganize it. And then the Chinese military is stronger for the reorganization. But he's gone and purged generals, and that has offended a lot of people at the top of the military. So the number one ranked uniformed officer in the military right now seems to be opposing Xi Jinping's purges, because we're seeing in the Chinese propaganda organs, in the military propaganda organs, all of these praises of quote-unquote collective leadership. Now, that's a direct slap at Xi Jinping because Xi Jinping believes that everybody in China must show complete and absolute loyalty to him. So he's the opposite of collective leadership. So these propaganda pieces in the Chinese military's main organ, which is PLA Daily, are a direct challenge to Xi Jinping's rule. And I'm sure that Xi Jinping is not very happy with what's going on in the military right now.
You know, President Trump, just a few days ago, Gordon, came out and talked about how important it was to beef up the U.S. military because he brought up China's military, specifically China's Navy. How much of a deficit are we at?
We're at a big deficit with Navy versus Navy in a sense. Our Navy is smaller, but it's more capable. But there's a couple of problems. First of all, the Chinese have some weapons that we don't have, and they're game-changer weapons, like hypersonic cruise missiles, which we really don't have adequate defenses for. But the bigger problem has nothing to do with China, and that is we've had a Navy leadership in our country for a decade that has been making one horrible decision after another. And we are seeing real problems in the Navy, especially with all of these major accidents that should not occur. So we had 2 destroyer accidents in 2016 and 2017, I think. There was the fire at the Bonhomme Richard in San Diego in port. We had the Navy shooting down one of its own F-18s recently. These are things that just should not happen, and they show a failure of accountability and the senior leadership of the Navy. Plus, they've also made some very bad decisions on ships, on acquisition of ships. There's poor management. You can spend an entire podcast or 3 or 4 of them talking about how bad things are in the Navy. So this is our problem, which I think that Pete Hegseth is starting to deal with. When Pete Hegseth talks about warrior ethos, this is what the Navy needs right now.
You know, we just heard the other day about the purchase of the F-47, the new, jet named after President Trump, of course, President 47. Do you think we need the same equivalent, is what you're saying? It seems like in the U.S. Navy, right?
What we need in the Navy, we don't need a big, high-profile project like the new fighter for the Air Force, because that won't come online and won't be available for more than a decade. What the Navy needs right now are the weapons to go to war in, let's say, the next couple years. And that means we're not talking about brand new aircraft carriers, which won't be commissioned for a very long time. What they need are drones. They need submarine drones. They need surface drones. They need to be able to swarm the Chinese. And these are things that will take a little while to field, but can be fielded relatively quickly, perhaps in time for a conflict with China. They're big ticket items, just I think are going to be arriving much too late.
Wow. How soon do you think there could be a conflict like you're talking about? I mean, are we talking years? Do you think it could happen that soon?
Well, in the military, you'll see Air Force officers with a patch, which is just simply 2027 on their left shoulder. And that's the year that people have talked about as when China will be ready for conflict. That's something called the Davidson window, named after a former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, who in an interview just sort of talked about how there could be a war in the Taiwan Strait in the year 2027. Now, it could be 2027, but it could also be 2026. It could be 2025. And the reason is we have to be prepared for anything, at any place, at any time. Right now, Xi Jinping, I think internally has a lot of motivation to go to war. And that means he can take us by surprise by doing something that we think would be irrational. For him to go to war when his military is not prepared to do it. And the reason is of the internal dynamics inside the leadership of the Communist Party. As I mentioned, Xi Jinping is being held accountable for policy mistakes. And he also knows that he's raised the cost of losing political struggles because he's been jailing his opponents, stripping them of their assets, and going hard after their families, which means there are a lot of people who are gunning for Xi Jinping, at least figuratively, if not literally. So I think that Xi Jinping is at risk. I think he believes he's at risk. And so therefore, he has an incentive to go to war, not to rally the Chinese people, who really do not want war, Rita. But he needs a war to prevent other senior Communist Party figures from challenging him. And this is, again, a tactic that Mao Zedong, his hero, used in the Cultural Revolution. He used the Cultural Revolution to get after his political enemies. Now, Mao didn't have the capability of starting a global war, but Xi Jinping does. And that's why, as I said, this could come at any time. And so we need to be thinking urgency. And clearly in the Navy and in the rest of the military, there is a lack of sense of urgency. So that troubles me greatly.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track. And ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
Yeah, it's great that at least it's getting back clearly on the radar with President Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth and others. They at least seem to be waking up clearly to this and aware of it, certainly much, much more than President Joe Biden was. I want to end where I began, Gordon Chang, and we talked about China and Iran. How close do you believe Iran may be to a nuclear weapon, and what kind of a role could China play with that?
You have to assume that they already have it. In July, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that they were like a week away. And that followed a comment from a senior Iranian lawmaker in the month or so before, or a couple of months before, who said that the time difference between getting the order and actually detonating an Iranian nuclear device was 1 week. And that sounds about right because they have a lot of enriched uranium. In February, the International Atomic Energy Agency said that Iran had enough 60% enriched uranium to make 6 nuclear devices if that uranium were enriched to 90%. Going from 60 to 90% is not that hard. And the IAEA found traces of 83.7% enriched uranium at the Fordo plant. So clearly the Iranians have the fissile material. The plans for a bomb are not that hard. We know that China has been largely responsible for giving Iran the ability to enrich uranium to weapons grade. We know that the Chinese have given plans, which the Iranians seem to have. And China's been selling materials for nuclear weapons directly to the Iranians. So Iran has a bomb, and we can thank Beijing for that.
Which is extremely dangerous to the world because you're dealing with actors who may use it, correct?
They very well may use it. Iran has said that they'd be willing to use it. And although we tend to discount a lot of what the Iranian leaders say, I think we have to take these hostile regimes at their word, and that we have to say, look, they're telegraphing their punches. And we ignored Osama bin Laden for a decade. But he kept on telling us what he was going to do, and he did it.
Yeah, which obviously was catastrophic, as we know. And you're right, we have to see evil and understand it and obviously take it head on before it gets worse. Gordon Chang, thank you so much. This was such a powerful conversation, and everybody be sure to subscribe and share to this podcast. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Rita. And I'm so happy that you used the word evil, because that's what we face right now. This is a battle. You know, people say this is China versus the United States. No, it isn't. This is China versus civilization.
Yeah, no, that's a great equivalent. And obviously, as you talk about their military potential and all these layers and all these tentacles of China, I'm so glad, Gordon, that you are sounding the alarm. It's really powerful.
Well, thank you, Rita.
And everybody, I'll be back soon with another great edition of Protecting America. And of course, you can catch me every weeknight, 10 p.m. to midnight on the legendary WABC Radio. This is Rita Cosby, and thanks for all you do to protect America.